Even though Doom is my all-time favorite id game, I have to concede and say that 1996 was the golden age of id Software with the release of Quake. This game felt like the end of a 5-year journey for id Software, as they perfected the art of making a first-person action experience. Wolfenstein was texture mapped, Doom was Wolfenstein times a million, but Quake was a fully 3D game. Gone were the sprites and flat 2D textures of old, and they were replaced with polygons. Quake blew past the competition at the time and was in a league of its own, at least from a technological perspective. id Software was on the top of the world at this time, and Quake was their golden child alongside Doom. The game also exploded onto the multiplayer scene and was one of the first real examples of a huge online experience. Quake had everything going for it, and that's not even counting the impact that the Quake engine had on the gaming landscape. In the many FPS games that came afterwards, they all still had traces of Quake's identity embedded, which is ironic, since Quake was born out of an internal struggle at id Software. Most Quake fans know that the game was being thought of during the Commander Keen days, and was originally going to be an action RPG of sorts. However, Quake wound up just being a continuation of what Doom built up with the FPS genre, and was a mess of cultist, fantasy, tech-based, and Lovecraftian elements. Ever since that first game, Quake has always had an identity crisis, and each entry did something almost completely different. I mean, I think Quake could have been about anything and would have still been just as influential to the industry, but it's no doubt creatively all over the place. And that kinda works at the same time. Quake feels like if the developers thought that they were never going to make another video game again, so they threw everything they wanted to make in. The game's style and the mix of all of these elements are certainly unique, and I've gotta respect it. Although, we've never seen a Quake game with Lovecraftian, gothic imagery like it again. Excluding the multiplayer boom it had, the impact on FPS games to come, and everything else that Quake achieved, which, by the way, was a ton, does the game still hold up well today? This is Quake, the golden age of id Software. Quake is a fascinating game since it defied all odds and came out on top. As I said before, this game was going to be successful no matter what, and everything mechanically was obviously sound, but people are still fond of Quake's style as well, and that's what I find most interesting. Quake feels not from this world, and is very abstract at times, and that works with the introduction of slipgates. I haven't brushed up on the Quake 1 lore in a long time, so forgive me, but the basic idea of the game is that you go around collecting these 4 runes from different dimensions to stop Shub-Niggurath, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, plans. She is some kind of witch goddess, and comes from the Cthulhu mythos. When you boot up Quake, you travel through these slipgates to pick your difficulty level and episode, and this is a huge part of why I think the game can get away with being so thematically diverse, on top of it obviously just being enjoyable. id Software can wave everything off with these slipgates. Oh, it's a different dimension, with this episode having gothic stages as well as tech-based ones. Don't worry about it too much. I also like the novel way that the player chooses their difficulty and episode. It's not just a simple menu, and this immerses you into the world of Quake. I mean, it even says the title loud and proud right here. Over the course of Quake's 4 episodes, I personally believe that the game's design runs a bit thin. Like you'll be seeing the same sort of thing throughout the entire experience. Tech bases, ancient stone castles, waste tunnels, haunted tombs, cultish palaces, etc. With the exception of the early tech bases, most of the levels in Quake don't have too much variety, but the gameplay more than makes up for it. The first thing to note with Quake's gunplay is how you can mouse look all over, and there's more movement options with jumping. There can be video after video about Quake's movements, but it introduced several arena FPS techniques such as bunny hopping, rocket jumping, and more. That's the overly simplified explanation without me being a total expert on the subject. There is also no use key, which is an interesting quirk I had to get used to after playing so much Doom during these past couple of months. The player still needs to hit switches like usual, but you can do that by bumping into them instead of hitting an additional button, which could accelerate the speed of players' runs. There are also specific sequences where you're required to press like 5 of the same sort of switches to activate a door from half a map away, and this is another method that Quake uses to immerse the player deeper into the game. As for the guns themselves, the standout of any id Software game, Quake has your typical collection of weapons on display. The Combat and Super Shotgun, in which the Combat Shotgun replaces the pistol slots entirely. This idea of erasing the pistol was carried over into Doom Eternal, for example, and since the enemies are more bullet spongy than other FPS games, I think this was a good decision on id Software's part with Quake. I believe the pistol would have been entirely useless and wouldn't have put a dent into the stronger enemies in the game. Quake features 2 versions of the nail gun, which is basically the game's equivalent of the machine gun and chain gun from other contemporary shooters. The nail gun is a fun weapon to use and is great for fodder control, as is every rapid-firing machine gun in id Software games. And that's kind of a point I'm making with Quake. The game is a culmination of everything that id Software was working hard on engine-wise since 1991, but in my opinion, it doesn't have a stronger identity as Doom. Quake is cool, don't get me wrong, and I like the gothic atmosphere, the Nine Inch Nails soundtrack, the out-of-this-world 3D graphics. I will always have an appreciation for Quake, and I obviously really like the game, but it doesn't have the it factor like Doom for me. Even though Quake opened up the doors so much with online multiplayer, modding support, the technical innovations, etc., if you strip back all of that, the game is pretty damn great. But I don't know, man, for me it doesn't reach the level of fun as Doom. With all that said, Quake is fucking awesome, and for 1996, this blew the competition out of the water. Even now, the game can be extremely eerie, and the early polygon enemies still have their charm. I feel like most of the enemies made in 90s FPS games hold up and have some sort of charm also. Like, you always appreciate the Pinky Demon, the Shambler, the Pig Cop, even the fat rednecks from Redneck Rampage. Yeah, maybe I'll take a look at that train wreck later. So the nail gun is based off of the Nine Inch Nails band, and this sets it apart from other machine guns at the time. Other Quake weapons include the Thunderbolt, which is basically a last resort weapon for me at least, when I'm on low health and want to kill a tough enemy quickly. Regardless, the game's gunplay is still extremely satisfying, especially when explosives make up a good 75% of the gameplay. The grenade launcher and rocket launcher, when you kill an enemy successfully with them, that might be the best feeling in the world. You just graduated, you might have had a kid, yeah fuck that, because when you destroy any monster in Quake with explosives, you'll say that it's the best day of your life. When you grab the explosive weapons in Quake, they become the most entertaining aspect of the game, and while the other guns are great in their own rights, come on. I think part of the reason blowing up enemies is even more satisfying in Quake than other FPS games at the time is that the monsters also fire explosive projectiles. Take the ogres for example. They have both a melee attack when you get up close and a grenade launcher when you're distant from them. These guys might be the most versatile enemy in the game, and they are probably the best one in Quake, let's be honest. The Shamblers are nicely designed and stem from Lovecraft works. The Knights and Death Knights are unique additions, and they have a real medieval look which we haven't seen too much in id Software games since. The regular soldiers and dogs are standard grunts and they don't really pose that much of a threat, and there's more enemies in Quake, but the ogre is the real standout in my opinion. Though the gunplay and everything is excellent, the bosses let Quake down, and this is the most common complaint with the game even after 20 years. The first episode's boss is this huge demon guy, and to be fair, he looks fucking sadistic. He seems like a badass, but unfortunately, he turns into a pushover really quick when all you have to do is lift this device down and electrocute him a couple of times. That's it. You don't attack him with your gun at all, and everything he attacks with can easily be dodged. Episode 2's boss is barely even a boss, but instead 1 or 2 Vors, depending on the difficulty. Now, the Vor is an enemy that becomes commonplace in the following episodes, and while they do offer up some challenge when mixed in with the other monsters, they aren't that hard as a boss fight. As for episodes 3 and 4, there isn't a boss encounter at all, and the final boss of the game, Shub-Niggurath, is also a pushover. Even though the final boss in Quake is piss easy, I do appreciate how there's a practical reward for beating all of the episodes. Over the course of the game, the episodes that you have beaten get blocked off, and when you complete them all, it grants you access to the final boss level, which I really like actually. That offers a bit of incentive to complete everything, and although the boss is nothing special, the ending text makes you feel like a fucking badass. id Software salutes me. That's awesome. However, all you need to do in order to kill the final boss is to telefrag it, which sounds awesome and is pretty unique for 1996 standards, but she doesn't even attack. Shub-Niggurath stands in place and doesn't throw anything back at you. A disappointing final boss though, which is par for the course with id Software games, doesn't ruin a great game, as Quake is still a classic. Even though I will always have a preference for Doom over Quake, the game continues to kick ass, with fan-made mods, and online multiplayer still happening if I recall correctly. The lack of thematic cohesion actually works with Quake, and the mix of science fiction and Lovecraft is kinda interesting to see. The level design, while it doesn't reinvent the wheel and gets a bit tired after the 4 episodes, is still pretty damn good, and offers up some cool experiences. For the first time in an id Software FPS, you could swim, you could jump, and grenades have realistic physics attached to them, and in general, Quake shook the gaming landscape for the rest of time. Aside from the revolutionary qualities of Quake, the game is still a very well designed 90s FPS, and aside from Duke 3D, which is one of my personal favorites, it is the best shooter from 1996. Hands down.